You're standing on a dusty path beside a river. The sun is beginning to set. A warm wind moves through tall reeds. In the distance, smoke rises from hundreds of rooftops. You've never seen anything like this before. For your entire life, people have lived in small villages. Maybe a few dozen families. Maybe a few hundred people. But this place is different. There are thousands here. People you've never met. People who don't know your family. People who don't even speak exactly like you. Ahead of you stands a massive wall. Beyond it are temples, workshops, markets, warehouses, and streets crowded with strangers. And yet somehow, it all works. Think about that for a second. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in small groups. Then, in what seems like the blink of an eye, we started building cities. Not villages, cities. Places so large and complicated that no single person could fully understand how they worked. So how did that happen? What convinced a species that spent most of its existence wandering through forests, grasslands, and river valleys to suddenly gather together by the tens of thousands? And perhaps more importantly, did humans create cities? Or did cities create a new kind of human? Picture this. A woman sits beside a small stone hut on a hillside, overlooking the eastern Mediterranean. The evening air smells of smoke and crushed grain. Nearby, children chase each other between houses. Nobody's packing their belongings. Nobody is preparing to move tomorrow. That might not sound unusual to us, but for most humans who had ever lived, it would have been. For generations, people followed food. When the animals moved, they moved. When seasons changed, they changed with them. Permanent homes were rare. But around 12,000 years ago, something strange began happening. Groups in the Levant started staying put. Archaeologists would later call them the Natufians. The name isn't important. What matters is the decision. Instead of constantly moving, many of these people began spending most of the year in one place. They built stone houses, stored food, buried family members beneath their homes, and slowly, almost accidentally, they started creating something new, a community rooted to the land. Now imagine being one of them. Your grandmother spent her life traveling. Your mother traveled less. You might become the first person in your family to spend nearly your entire life in the same settlement. That's a huge shift, and it raises an obvious question. Why stay? The answer seems simple. Food. But here's where things get interesting. Food wasn't actually guaranteed. In fact, nature was about to make life much harder. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth suddenly cooled. Scientists call this period the Younger Dryas. Temperatures dropped, weather patterns shifted. Many of the wild plants people depended on became less reliable. Some settlements struggled, others disappeared entirely. At first glance, it looks like the experiment had failed. But it hadn't, because while people might leave a settlement, they don't necessarily abandon an idea. And the idea that changed everything was this. What if food could be stored? What if neighbors could become permanent? What if a place could belong to a community instead of a season? The climate changed. The idea survived. And that's where the story changes. As the Ice Age finally loosened its grip, humans across different parts of the world began experimenting with something revolutionary. Farming. Not all at once, not everywhere, and definitely not perfectly. For thousands of years, people slowly learned which plants produced bigger harvests, which seeds were worth saving, which animals could be controlled. Generation after generation, tiny decisions began reshaping entire species. Wheat changed, barley changed, rice changed, humans changed too. Most people assume agriculture immediately created cities, but that's not what happened. In fact, farmers existed for thousands of years before true cities appeared. Picture this. You're standing on a rooftop. Below you is one of the largest settlements on Earth. Thousands of people live here. Homes are packed tightly together. There are no streets, no roads. People climb across rooftops like a giant human honeycomb. This place is called Çatalhöyük, and it existed roughly 9,000 years ago. Now here's the surprising part. Despite its size, there are no obvious palaces, no giant royal compounds, no clear evidence of kings ruling everyone, thousands of people living together, yet no obvious ruler. Think about that for a second. Maybe cities didn't begin with power, maybe they began with proximity, with neighbors, with people simply choosing not to leave. But if large settlements already existed, why weren't they cities? What was still missing? The answer may have flowed through water. Picture a farmer standing beside a river. The water is both a blessing and a threat. Too little water means famine. Too much water means disaster. Every year, the river changes everything. And eventually, people realize something important. They can control it. Canals are dug, levees are built, irrigation networks spread across the landscape. Suddenly, farming becomes far more productive. But there's a catch. No single family can build an irrigation system. Not even a village can manage it alone. Thousands of people have to cooperate. And once thousands of people begin coordinating their work, something bigger starts to emerge: a society. Now imagine another scene. Hundreds of people are walking across the countryside. Some have traveled for days, others for weeks. They're all heading toward the same destination. Nobody lives there permanently. Nobody owns it. Yet everyone knows where it is. Researchers eventually discovered a place that may have looked something like this. Göbekli Tepe. Massive stone pillars rise from the earth. Many were carved long before traditional farming became widespread, which creates a fascinating mystery. Why gather hundreds or even thousands of people if you're not farming? One possibility is surprisingly human: stories, beliefs, rituals, celebrations. The need to gather, the need to belong. Think about modern sports stadiums, concerts, or festivals. Humans have always traveled long distances to be part of something larger than themselves. Maybe the earliest large gatherings worked the same way. Maybe community came before cities, and maybe cities grew out of that feeling. But eventually another problem appeared: storage. Because once you store food, you create something valuable, and valuable things attract attention. From animals, from thieves, from rivals. Suddenly protecting food becomes just as important as growing it. Which brings us to Jericho. Imagine approaching a settlement around 8000 BC. Ahead of you stands a stone wall. Inside rises a tower nearly 9 meters tall. That's roughly the height of a modern 3-story building. Now ask yourself, why would a small farming community build something like that? Because the wall isn't just protection, it's a statement. It tells everyone who sees it: we can work together. We can organize labor. We can build something larger than ourselves. And once a community learns that lesson, there's no going back. But perhaps the biggest breakthrough wasn't a wall, or a tower, or even farming. It was counting. Stay with me, because this changes everything. Imagine you're responsible for storing grain. Thousands of people depend on that grain. You need to know who delivered it, who received it, how much remains, how much is owed. Eventually, memory isn't enough, so people begin creating records. Small clay tokens, marks, symbols, lists. At first, they're simple, but over time, something incredible happens. The symbols become writing, not stories, not poems, not history, accounting. Think about that. One of humanity's greatest inventions may have begun because someone needed better bookkeeping. The city was becoming too complex for memory alone, and once information could live outside the human brain, cities could grow much larger. Now imagine approaching southern Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago. The air is hot, canals cut across the landscape, boats move through waterways carrying goods from distant places. Ahead of you rises a city unlike anything humanity had seen before: Uruk. This wasn't a village. This wasn't a town. This was something entirely new. Tens of thousands of people lived here. Temples dominated the skyline. Administrators tracked resources. Craftsmen specialized in individual trades. Merchants connected distant regions. And scribes pressed symbols into clay tablets that would survive for thousands of years. The city had become a machine powered by food, labor, trade, information, and belief. But here's where things get even more interesting. Cities didn't just organize resources, they organized people. You learned new rules, new habits, new expectations. You stood in lines, worked schedules, traded with strangers, followed laws, trusted records. Most of these behaviors feel normal to us. But to your hunter-gatherer ancestors, they would have seemed incredibly strange. The city wasn't just changing the landscape, it was changing human psychology. And that's why the rise of cities matters so much. Because cities didn't appear in only one place. Versions of them emerged in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, the Americas. Different cultures, different environments, different histories. Yet again and again, humans crossed the same threshold. Why? Researchers still debate the answer. Was it food, trade, religion, climate, technology? The reality is probably all of them. Cities emerged when multiple forces aligned at the same time. But perhaps the most surprising part of the story is this: none of the people building the first storehouses knew they were inventing cities. None of the canal diggers knew they were helping create civilization. None of the scribes pressing symbols into wet clay knew they were laying the foundations for modern bureaucracy. Each step seemed small, reasonable, practical. A storehouse here, a wall there, a canal, a record, a market, a temple, a neighborhood. And then one day humanity looked around and found itself living in something entirely new, which raises a bigger question. If the first cities slowly reshaped the way humans think, work, cooperate, and live, what are today's cities doing to us right now? Because the story of cities never really ended. You and I are still living inside it.